Hello everyone, I'm Grandmaster Denes Boros, and this is the game of the week. And this time we are going to peruse the games by the legend himself, Shakhriyar Mamedyarov, the winner of the first Grand Chess Tour of the year. He actually had an astounding streak, a winning streak, so to say, which catapulted him in first place. Now, he didn't really have such a great event at the beginning. It was sort of slowish, making a couple of draws, nothing extremely outrageous. And I felt that we should take a look at all those games, see what differentiated his game to your regular Berlin games that you see in the other tournaments. Alright, so let's take a look. Lupulescu is the opponent he's facing. He's playing black. Knight f3, d5, just claiming the center. Very, very consolidating move. Not the aggressive Shakh Mamedyarov play. Shakh used to play the King's Indian and the Grunfeld, so both of these systems. And I point that out because these are aggressive systems where you need to be resolute and aggressive in order to succeed. So Shakh Mamedyarov is capable of playing aggressive chess, but this time he's taking a more restrained approach, even though he is 100 points higher rated than his Romanian opponent. e3, e6, c4. And the very next move by Mamedyarov is nothing special. You'd think it doesn't really change the whole flow of the game, but actually it does. Because Lupulescu's plan is the following: get the knight out, get the pawn to b3, go to bishop b2. If that ever happens, white might actually build an attack. For example, knight f6, knight c3, bishop e7, b3, here, bishop b2, c5, takes, knight takes, queen c2, and oftentimes what you see is an h4, knight g5 direct attack on the king side. Now that is something that Mamedyarov not necessarily want to endure or face. So instead he plays this very, very rare move of bishop e7, which is the 5th or 6th most popular out there. So not at all the main lines. Now, bishop e7 is not just a move. It gives Shakhriyar Mamedyarov extra options which he wouldn't have in other cases. So b3, and here comes the kicker. The knight is not in the way this time, and he can go bishop f6. Now, bishop f6 might not be objectively the best move, but it does serve Mamedyarov's purpose. He's getting Lupulescu out of his comfort zone. It's already not what he was predicting to happen. This is not the variation he sort of thought is going to be on the board. Knight c3, knight e7. And these are those interesting moments in chess when you're facing an idea that's novel to you, that you've never seen before. And there are thoughts that come to your mind. Should I do what I would do anyways? Or should I just get my pieces out? Should I go castle quickly? Or should I punish the fact that this bishop has taken the knight's normal spot, which would be on f6? Now here Lupulescu decides to go bishop b2, but bishop b2 is sort of admitting, okay, you played a move that is not the standard way of playing, but I'm still going to follow on with my regular plans. But it does turn out white had this extra option of getting the bishop to a3, trying to put pressure along this diagonal and stopping Shakhriyar from playing c5. Even if they take, you could take with the bishop, and white has good control and he has more coverage of the center squares. Now, in some sense, you can call this Mamedyarov's bluff. He's saying Lupulescu isn't going to challenge me in this subvariation. He is just going to play his casual chess and try to play from there. So bluff number one is paying off. Now you might be wondering, okay, but what's the big deal with this play and let's say some other solid players playing in a more consolidated style, like knight f6, the one move I mentioned before? Well, this one already poses questions for Lupulescu, and he does have to waste some time realizing how to continue on. So what Shakhriyar is doing is to putting pressure on move 4 already on white, asking questions and slowly piling it till he crumbles. But let's continue on. Bishop b2, c5. And that's actually the problem. It allows the black pieces to take the control, and now even d4 is soon going to be a threat. Queen c2. Well, not just yet though, because in case of d4 there is knight e4, and this bishop on f6 is hanging and is not going to have an easy time moving around. Knight b6. All right, so let's take a look at this position and think about a couple of moves that I could play here. Obviously, we definitely consider taking on d5, but that would only strengthen Shakhriyar's position, getting this mummified bishop out to either f5 or g4, and in both cases, that bishop is going to be massively strong. So c takes d5 is right out here. What else could we do in this position? What would make sense just if we follow the old tried and tested methods of playing chess? Well, our king is still stuck in the center, so it's not the happiest piece out there. So it could make sense for us to try to give it and find it some safety and shelter. So a move that would be a consideration is to go bishop e2 and just prepare castling. Bishop d3 would be a little bit pushing it. Black does have some threats as kind of knight b4, hitting the queen and the bishop at the same time. So especially in these very unique and close positions, you've got to be on the lookout for unusual threats by the opponent. And here Mamedyarov does have this tricky idea of knight b4 that in other cases wouldn't be as dangerous. So you could even try to go a3. Try avoid that, and then you can still go bishop d3. And if d4, you can still go knight e4, and the bishop and the pawn is under attack, and white is doing quite well. Knight a4. And knight a4 is sort of a step in the wrong direction. Why? Well, it's forcing exchanges, but as we all know, exchanges favor the side with less space. And at the moment, it's black who has pieces that are a bit cramped. This bishop is crammed on c8, and this f6 bishop wasn't particularly as good. Knight a4, b6. Another win for Shakhriyar. So you will see how Mamedyarov is accumulating his advantage. He's not just going to outrun and run Lupulescu off the board. He's slowly going to gain a bit of space, then some more time, and then suddenly it's going to be game over. b6 takes, g takes. Now, to Lupulescu's credit, these pawns do get doubled, and that is a benefit. C takes d5. Okay, this is a critical moment, so let's just think about this for a second. How would we want to take back? We've got three options. seemingly all same value. Well, one of them is much less good than the others, but the top two is close to each other, close to be the best. So we've got to make a decision, and this is the critical moment. If you want to play more of this tank type of chess, where you're not really giving away too much for your opponent, you might be doing a little bit of provocation, as Mamedyarov is allowing his doubled pawns, but you still have to be very accurate, because one little slip and your advantage might just be gone. So e takes d5 is not great and wasn't played by Shakhriyar, because as the e pawn moves, the more lonely those double pawns get. Those pawns get very lonely, and it's much easier to go after them with queen b2 and put pressure on the f pawn. So that kind of leaves us with knight takes and queen takes. And both knight takes and queen takes looks good, but queen takes actually thinks about an important principle of having everything defended and under control. If you go knight d5, there is bishop b5, knight e7, and white might even risk the biscuit with d4, put pressure on c5, and you see all those pins working out for white's favor. And all this happened because you left your knight undefended. So that's why here Shach went for queen takes d5. Also, in case of any trouble, the e-pawn is there to block with e5 and just control everything. Queen takes d5. It is correct, though, that it invites the knight back, but sometimes you do have to give some things away. Queen h5. And here Lupulescu goes knight e4. Now knight b5 looks tempting, but it doesn't really do too much. There is this one trick on c7, setting up the fork, but black can castle, just put the king into safety, or do the little bit more artificial king f8 with the same idea of getting the king to g7 and just chilling there. So there are some superfluous moves that Lupulescu can go for in this position, but they really don't have any firepower behind them. There's only one knight, and it's not going to be enough for success. So knight e4, queen g6. Again, probing Lupulescu, trying to provoke some play and provoking white to overextend. Because so far, even if white is just sitting around, he's probably not in danger of being worse. Bishop e2 is not necessarily even the strongest move, but white can just go castle, let's say knight g3, and white is more or less still in the game. Nothing to really fear in this situation. So Mamedyarov continues on with being an agent provocateur and goes queen g6, saying, hey, you see my queen eyeing yours? Yes, that's what I want. I want a little bit of drama. And if you go with knight d6 check, there is, well, you can definitely go king f8. Maybe king d7 is a little bit too much due to knight e4. Probably king f8 is even better. And a trade will not do you too much. I will get my pawns all huddled up, and black does have the d4 square under control, so black is close to being equal and will have chances to get even better. And this is the moment when you see Mamedyarov taking over. He might be a slightly bit worse, but already Lupulescu has to face some uncomfortable questions. Knight h4, queen h6, knight d6, here knight takes c8, rook takes c8. If you ask me, I think still knight f3 would be a better move for Lupulescu. Lupulescu is actively pursuing exchanges, and these trades are no good because with every trade, Shach gets closer to organize his pieces. Just look at the position now. This bishop on c8 is still stuck in there. It will take some time for Mamedyarov to organize it. You can't go bishop b7 due to knight d6 check, so it will take some work. Queen h6, but he played knight d6, king f8, and to prove my point, Mamedyarov gets to put his rook on the open file and not even move that c8 bishop at all. So knight d6 is probably one of the inaccurate moves. Here Shakhriyar might be already even and getting very close to be slightly better. g3. Okay, so let's stop here. Let's try to observe this a little bit and realize which squares will be critical in the long run for both sides. There are two very important squares that both black and white wants to control. Which one of those do you guys think is the most important one in this game? Now, yeah, d4 obviously is an important square, but there is always a square close to a weak one, and that's the d1. So this d3 square can be pretty problematic, especially if this knight can hop to b4. So if the bishop moves, there is potential ideas of going rook d8, knight b4, and you take over everything. So there's actually two big critical squares, d4 and in some respect b4, although it is in somewhat with relation of the d3 square. So rook d8, basically setting up that idea. He is fortifying the d4 square, and also make sure in case of bishop g2, he has knight b4, hitting the queen and getting ready to play a knight d3. And now white is in big trouble because he will lose the right to castle and everything is under a clampdown. So rook d8, bishop e2. Now all that said, Lupulescu's position is by no means tragic. His position is fine, but there are some unusual weaknesses he has to deal with. There is a couple of weaknesses along this diagonal, and the d2 pawn is a backwards one. King g7, a3. So we already figured out that d4 square is going to be super important, and then the b4 square is the other one. We've got to find a target. We've got to find a target, otherwise it's very difficult to win a chess game. We already talked about a bit of Lupulescu's king side, but it's pretty rock solid over there. It's a whole mountain of pawns. We're never going to crash through, or not yet. f5, f4 seems unlikely to work because we've got that f4 square covered. So that will leave us to the one and only target that Mamedyarov can go against. Which pawn is that? We can't really invade squares by now because the bishop is controlling all those. Now, again, this is one of those things that I always say, you can only attack pawns that are visible to you. Things that are invisible, very, very difficult to go after those. So here, the strongest move for Shah is rook d6, undermining the d2 pawn. So you're going after the d2 pawn, preparing the idea of doubling on the d file. f4, rook d8. And f4, I feel, is useful, but you can feel that white is sort of creating more and more weaknesses in his position. So rook d8, rook d1. Any threats by white? Not really. f5, there's always knight d5 and knight d3 ideas. That's not something that black needs to worry about. But he still wants to make sure that this pawn structure is fixated so Lupulescu doesn't get overtly aggressive. Now I think here Lupulescu is just a bit too quick to move the knight. I'd still think castling would be much better and just wait for a better moment to move the knight away and defend the d2 pawn. Like it's just a better choice. Knight f3, knight d5. Again, simple chess. He put all his rooks on the open file, got the knight in the center. Castles. Okay. So the knights are perfectly placed, the rooks are perfectly placed, but then comes the dilemma of trying to figure out what Lupulescu is planning to do. So if Lupulescu was to move, we've got to consider all sorts of pawn breaks and all sorts of tricks and traps. So what would be all those tricky moves that Mamedyarov needs to consider? The couple of moves that are annoying to deal with for black. It is actually, by the way, a reversed hedgehog. A typical reversed hedgehog structure. And in a reversed hedgehog, you always play for breaks. And this case is non-different to that. Well, the e-pawn is closer to the center, so black would be happy to trade an f-pawn for the e-pawn. That would still definitely be a decent position for black, actually. e4 is no good. You want to keep your center pawns, if possible. So one of the typical pawn breaks you can go for and think about is b4, indeed. b4 ideas is very typical. Now black has everything under control there, but it's still a critical way of playing. And if it's successful, it usually destroys the structure. And the other one is queen b2. So it's either b4 or queen b2. Now, as Mamedyarov knows that's not going to happen, he will start working against this idea of queen b2. So queen b2 is on tap, therefore Shah plays king g8. King g8, and if you go queen b2, that's not a check. Now you might be wondering, why is that so important? Why would you move it away and not let your opponent check? Well, the reason you go king g8. Now, if in case of queen b2, you can make a different move. So let's say you'll go rook d7, queen b2 check, king g8. A lot of times you'd realize I regret moving my rook to that square. I would have played anything else but this one. This could run into knight e5 ideas, attacking both the rook and the knight on c6. Not ideal, right? It's not what we want to have. If you go king g8, they go queen b2, you get the exact same position with Shah getting to decide where he wants to put his pieces. So that's why king g8 is such a big move, or prophylactic, as you will. Rook b1, a5. Lupulescu wanted to go for b4 breaks, but Shah says, no way, it ain't happening today. Bishop b5. Okay, so if you look at this position, you might be wondering who's having the better chances. Would it be white or black? Well, for that you always have to check the middle of the board. And as you can tell, it is black who's controlling the most important squares. There is a knight firmly positioned in the middle of the board, and the c-pawn is stopping any counter d4 moves, trying to challenge that. Not to mention, the e-pawn's a weakness. By the way, in case of knight e5, there will be some splendid sacrificial ideas for black in the face of knight takes f4. If you take here, wait, does this even work? Rook takes. There is possibly queen c4. b5, queen b5, knight d4. Or knight takes, f takes, queen e3. Well, this is probably still surviving for white, but already kind of scary, so it's not something we would go after. So already you can see, you make one false move, and your position might just crumble. Bishop b5, knight e7. Now, if knight e5 would be happening this time, there is knight takes e3, d takes, and you have to part with either your queen or the game after queen takes h2. Like if you go here, this queen takes h2 checkmate, and it's game over. So even though Lupulescu isn't quite lost yet, he has to tread carefully, and there could be a trouble brewing. Now anywhere you put that knight, knight takes e3 will be on tap. Rook fd1, knight f6. Again, using the fact that he has everybody lined up on the d file. Bishop f1, knight g4. By the way, instead of rook fd1, if Lupulescu was vigilant enough in his defenses, he would have realized he can go something like rook f2, over defending the d2 square, maybe even move the rook to g2, and then in the long run you may even try to expose that king on g8. That would have been a little bit more of a thematic way of playing, combining defensive ideas with more aggressive ones. So rook d1, knight f6, bishop f1, knight g4. Again, not necessarily the best move, but it's a very good human move by Mamedyarov. He is hinting at threats on h2, and Lupulescu will also have to be on the lookout of knight takes e3. And just watch in case of b4, there's captures, captures, captures. You can't really capture here because of that very idea of knight takes e3. So the way Shach is playing this game is of a boxer, not necessarily packing punches, but pushing the opponent down and next to the wall, just making sure that there's not enough space for maneuvering for the opponent. So here, Lupulescu goes h3, but h3 is sort of a concession. If you guys can tell me, that'd be great. So let's just stop here and realize what could be the downside of pushing that pawn. What will be the difference from the previous position where the pawn was on h2 instead of h3? There is a big difference. There is a big difference. And that sort of has to do with the pawn structure. That g3 pawn was well guarded earlier, but after you moved it, move the h pawn that is, you will have a constant weakness on g3. And he did not know that will be the end-all, be-all of the whole game. At f6, d3. And now you are going to see how Mamedyarov will consequently shift his attention from the d pawn to the g pawn. Knight c6, rook e1, queen g7. Already pointing out the soft spot on g3, saying, hey man, that is something you've got to deal with. It's an important pawn, you've got to deal with it. Queen f2. All right, so far, so good by Mamedyarov, although Lupulescu is defending very well. He is guarding the g-pawn. Everything seems to be fine. There is going to be that king h2 move, so white is not at all losing on the spot. So as black, we need to come on in and put even more pressure on the g-pawn if we can. How could we go about that? So right now, we only have a queen attacking the g-pawn. That's definitely not going to make it rain. So our rooks are basically out of a job. They're staring at a d-pawn that is niftily defended by that bishop on f1. We're definitely not going to win it. So they're looking for something to do. King h8. Getting that rook to g8, shifting gears and going on the g file. Trying to do their best to pass the test. King h2, rook g8. Now, all of these moves that we're looking at are very sudden and surprising, because they're not your bam, 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 bam move where Mamedyarov is just crashing through. All these moves are prophylactic, kind of anticipating action. Knight g4 was a probing idea, but then he anticipated all of the moves happening and went king h8, rook g8, immediately going after the g-pawn. Bishop e2. Knight d5, again activating the knight. And this is what makes super grandmasters so scary good at this game. They make sure they occupy the most important squares. And if they do, their chances of succeeding just rises to the maximum. Now Lupulescu played bishop f1, and after this move, his life turned into a misery from a fun one. So it is black to move and unleash the worst for white. So black has a very, very, very strong move. If you were following the trajectory of the game, it won't be too difficult to find. Mamedyarov was very consequent. He went for the direct attack of the d pawn, then he shifted his attention to the g file. So all was pushed on the d file, and now he's going to shift his attention to the g file. What would be the move, and what is the idea behind that move? Exactly, e5. And that's actually the beauty of Shakh Mamedyarov's game. He spots these very creative solutions that others often miss. It has to do with his innate talent plus his attitude and fondness of complicated positions. Now, he was known to play all these Benoni King's Indian structures, and there you have to be creative in order to succeed. So when I saw this position, I was 100% sure and certain that Shakh wouldn't miss e5, because this is his style of play, going after the g pawn that way. F takes, rook g6. Going over for the g3 pawn, and suddenly there's nobody who can defend it. If you go g4, that's just getting captured. And with your king this breezy, out in the open, not being covered by guardian pawns, it is more likely to perish this game. So the only move that Lupulescu tries is knight h4, seemingly threatening to both take on f5 and take on g6. Rook takes g3, fearless. And in the game, Lupulescu played pawn to d4, but the big question really is, what should black do in the case of knight to takes f5? What would be black's response? And obviously, Shakh Mamedyarov wouldn't have played this move if he didn't see the answer. This is a spectacular move that wins on the spot, but it is very nice and nuanced. So whenever you're trying to find a brilliant winning move, you should always envision the square you will end up checkmating on. Kind of using the dream technique. You want to envision in your brain and your mind where you want that mate to happen. Which square will be the one where the mate will land on? And once you get that, you're probably going to find the move, wasn't played by Shakh, but was intended to play by Shakh. Rook f3. rook f3, and the square where the mate would land is obviously on g1 because of this bishop's unfortunate placement. There's queen g1 and the king can't go anywhere there, and that is a sad, sad news, and will be pretty nasty. By the way, there is no knight takes g7 because of rook takes f2 check. There is a knight and king under attack. And if white goes king g1, obviously you don't take on g7, you just move the rook away. If they want to pin all those guys, you capture, you can't take it. If e4, well, no worries, you're going to take on g2 and have a winning position. And now white's position quickly crumbles. d4, queen g5, knight g2, c takes, e takes, and the last touch by Shah prompts resignation from Lupulescu. So it's black to move and win. This one is a pretty one, although not as hard as the rook f3 find. So I see knight takes d4 being mentioned, but what if I just capture that back? What would be the issue over there? If knight takes d4 would be captured, what is the problem with that? Knight takes d4, and by the way, so knight takes d4, Lupulescu did resign, but the reason there is no capture, it's not rook takes h3, because the king could run to g1, but the idea of rook takes g2, here, here, and the unlikely but pretty queen g3 checkmate. So that is the reason after knight d4, Lupulescu resigned. So this was the very first game by Mamedyarov, like very first win. And now you're going to see him take on Levon Aronian with the white pieces. And you're going to see a similar attitude, yet a little bit less provocative. So let's take a look at that one. Let's take a look at that game by Mamedyarov, where he is actually not going to be too aggressive, fairly solid, but then when he spots the right moment, he takes his chances. So this is the next game. Mamedyarov is playing Levon, and this was not the greatest time for Levon, as he has been already kind of struggling in the event. So d4, again, Shakhriyar is aiming for a slower game, not trying to trade off and get a fighting position. Knight f3, knight c3, check, e3. A very topical line in the Ragozin. Bishop b4 is known to be the Ragozin variation. And what Shak is saying, after this check knight c6, your pawn on c7 is blocked off, and you won't have an easy time moving it forward, which is a typical plan. If you do not know, oftentimes black would be aiming to undermine white's center with this move c7 to c5 and get some active play on white's queen side. When Shah goes for queen a4, he makes sure that Levon doesn't get any direct attacking chances. Castles, bishop d2, d takes, bishop d6. And this sort of have a feel of the Queen's Gambit. Queen's Gambit accepted. Jean Luthier used to have very similar positions. And if that name doesn't ring a bell to you, he was a prominent grandmaster in the 90s and was famously the second of Vladimir Kramnik in his match versus Kasparov. So here white goes for queen c2, e5, trying to open it up. And I always talk about this, but I think it's worth repeating. If your opponent's king is in the center, don't feel shy to open up the position. And that is exactly what Levon does. He goes for e5 immediately, trying to expose Shakhriyar's king. e5, d takes, knight takes, bishop takes, e5. Now, if white could just start rolling those pawns with e4, f4, and e5, this would be a position considered to be strategically won by white. So Shach attempts f4. Now, here comes the dilemma for Levon, how to react. If he relaxes too much, as we said, the e-pawn might just roll to e5, and it is a strategical loss. There's no coming back from it. With the bishop so bad on c8 and passive, that's unlikely to be enough counterplay for Levon. So Levon takes on c3. Bishop takes c3. And that, on the surface, looks like a horrible decision. But, in fact, is the right move by Levon so far. He's saying, yes, you're going to get the bishop pair, but that will only benefit you in the long term. But in the short term, I can take advantage of the fact that your king is still stuck in the middle. So let's try to channel our inner Lev Aronians and try to find the most aggressive move that we can possibly play here as black. Try to find an aggressive move that sort of keeps Shach's king in the center. Knight g4. Very good. So there is no castling because it runs into all kinds of pins and attacks. It's a family fork as well. So that is no good. So knight g4 is very forcing by Levon. Doesn't let Shach go castle and consolidate. Shakhriyar has to go bishop d4. c5, again, forcing the bishop away. Rook e8, hitting this pawn. Now, even though Shach also got a pawn, it kind of misplaced the bishop. And now Levon has ample play against that weakness, not to mention that king in the center. So Shach decides to go for safety and castle here. And interestingly enough, Levon's next move is a mistake. Queenside castling is not a great idea because it's not usually accepted by the rules of chess. There is still a queen guarding that square, so you cannot do that. So interestingly enough, Levon should have gone b6, win some time, so eventually that bishop could show up on the long diagonal and be quite strong. But instead he got a little bit impatient and took on e3 instead. Bishop takes, rook takes e3. The difference? The bishop is still very much passive on c8, and as long as it's stranded there, the rook on a8 will be a prisoner as well. So it's a common technique in these type of positions to liquidate all your opponent's good pieces and then go after some weaknesses. But first off, let's try to pinpoint Levon's weakest link in his position, because that will be very, very important. His back rank is obviously super duper weak, but in order to get a back rank mate, you gotta get some people close to the back rank. And so therefore he played rook e1. Now there was another square that I was hoping to hear about, and that's the f7 pawn. Like traditionally, the f7 and its mirror pawn on f2 are the weakest links in chess. And if you ever played any sort of gambit, Scotch gambit, King's gambit, what have you, you notice how easy it is to attack that pawn and maybe even just deliver a checkmate. So the reason why Shach played rook e1 is he could double it up, get ready for that intrusion, and then there is that back rank idea that White has been dreaming of. Rook takes e1, rook takes e1. Now we have some threats, and now Levon is by no means losing, but his pieces are sort of jumbled up and still on the 8th, grasping for some air. So he goes bishop d7. But bishop d7 is already kind of suspecto. Mamedyarov pounces at this chance. I mean, literally pounces. Goes queen b3, not only hitting the f7 pawn, but hitting the b pawn as well. The typical double attack where you're facing very many, or sometimes too many issues. Queen f6, you take that pawn. You take that pawn on b7. Queen d4 check, king h1, rook e8. And on the surface, everything's all right for Levon. There are plenty of weaknesses. The bishop and the pawn is being attacked. It doesn't seem like anything bad can happen here. But in comes Shakhriyar Mamedyarov's fantastic spotted idea. So it is Shakhriyar White to move and win the game. So remember, even if there are not many pieces left, the back rank still can remain an issue. So the first move is obviously takes. Bishop takes e8. Now we've got a couple of things to deal with. One of them is queen f4. The other one is taking, and we also have our back rank issues. So our next move has to be forcing and has to answer to all of those questions. And indeed, it is bishop takes f7. Now what happens in case of bishop takes f7? It's not the move played by Levon, but the critical question. What if they just accept the sacrifice? What if they just do so? Queen c8, yes. Bishop e8, and queen takes c8. Back rank checkmate. So if your opponent doesn't really create luft with h6 or g6, oftentimes you do run into ideas such as this one. And that's just about it. You can't stop that. Bishop takes f7, and this was a rude awakening for Levon, where he actually thought he was very close to equalizing. And he almost did, but he missed this idea of bishop takes f7. King f8. But we still got questions to answer. And that's actually the toughest part of chess. Everybody is very much aware of tactical ideas, but it's never the end of the game. The game and the last phase just begins. You have to proceed to checkout. You have to make sure you don't forget about your opponent's threats. And believe it or not, the biggest reason everybody is losing when they see these tactics is that they do not care or do not pay attention to opponent's threats. So what is Levon threatening right now? It's obviously the back rank, but after king f8, bishop takes f7 becomes an issue as well. And with that, you're kind of finding your own thread and finding your own way of succeeding. Now, here the right move is bishop b3, over defending the d1 square and defending against bishop f7. So the goal and the most important part that you always have to look out for is your opponent's threats. They're sometimes even more important than your own. Queen c5. Again, quite a deadly threat. Queen d5. So a little bit of attacking the queen and also setting up queen g8. Check. Bishop d1 takes. Now he realizes that there is no mate there as long as he can get the queen to a7 and back. Check. Here takes. h5 and h3. Bishop c6. Check. King h7, queen f7. Again, still watching out for trickies. If you're not paying attention, Levon can go here, here. Well, king h2 is mate, but mostly bishop takes g2 check. And it's that easy. You missed a half a move and your advantage is gone. And it's already unclear. So bishop b3, queen f7, check, queen c5, check, g6, queen f6. So most of Schach's move is to provoke some weaknesses around the king and then to consolidate, taking away all those tricky checks from Levon. Bishop d7, h4, setting up the mating idea. I mean, mating ideas are great, but you still have to be very vigilant. Queen c7, queen c8, check, queen f7. And here Levon resigned because in case of king h6, there's queen g8 with a mass trade on that side of the board, and it is just game over with Shakhriyar having 2 pawns on the roll on the queen side. There's absolutely nothing that really can happen there. So the last game that I wanted to touch upon is the game between Fabiano Caruana and Shakhriyar Mamedyarov. So he was already on a streak. He won the first game versus Lupulescu, then another one against Levon Aronian, and now he's facing Fabiano. And there are some people who would take it easier, but Shah kind of felt, hey, this is the right moment, I'm in a good shape, let's just go on and try to go for it. Knight c6, and somewhat surprisingly, Shakhriyar plays knight f6 instead of his trusted and well-tried variation in the open Spanish, which he played quite frequently. And of course, he played the bishop e7 main lines as well, namely the Briar. But this time he goes for knight f6, and this surprises Fabiano. Goes d3 and knight c3. But much to Fabiano's surprise, he's going to get surprised again. In this position, most everybody goes d6. But instead, Shakhriyar goes knight d4, which is the 4th, 5th most popular move in the position. So it comes as a shocker for Fabi. And that is a very good sign for Mamedyarov. He's going to get a fighting game with Fabi sort of half out of preparation and with plenty of pieces on the board. So I know Berlin gets a bad rep, but if you look at this one, the fact that there's all of the pieces on the board does mean that there's still something to play for. What's boring is more of the endgame that they played previously. These positions can get very rich and lively. Bishop a4, c6, castle, d6. Just consolidating, and surprisingly enough, we are transposing right back into a 4 knights opening. Knight takes d4, h3. And Shah's next move is astounding. It's just an astounding move. It's not nobody even thought about it for a split second that this move can get there. Now, if there would be a pawn take on e5, then black could go c6, castles, and black will get quick development for the sacrificed pawn. That is the critical question. But Fabiano this time did not want to get into complications, which could be something along these lines of taking on f7, giving up the 2 pieces for the rooks, but white gets plenty of pawns. Instead, he went for this one. And here, Shah unleashes his trusted and tried g5 move. Quite a spectacular one, as white has committed early with castling. Black is fancying his chances with g5, g4. And you'd be saying, oh, this idea was never seen before. Now think again. This very same idea was played by Shah, but in a different variation. I do want to show it to you. So it's the same in the Spanish. a6, bishop a4, d6, castles, g5. This has been Shah Mamedyarov's big win in this line. This g5 idea has been recurring in his games with great success. The idea being very similar, trying to put pressure on the king side, this time trying to dissuade white from getting the d4 move in. But back to the game, to g5. Here Fabiano had one move that he could have tried to play here, but didn't play. Went for knight d5, could have went for knight d5, because this pin on the king on e8, and it's just not going to be able to capture. If you go b5, white can capture on f6 and bishop b3, and then you're not having the best of positions. Knight e2, but he's sort of missing his chances. Bishop b6, c3. So Fabiano decides to go for the slow route, but in this case, the center is locked down. There's literally no advantage for either side, but Shah has a little bit more pressure on the king side. Therefore, Shah's advantage is kind of apparent. Now, Shah's next move is rook g8. He goes on the attack on the g file. He's not playing g4. Know that he doesn't play g4. He knows that the threat is bigger than the execution and prepares that idea. Now Fabiano understands that he's in big trouble. He can't just go bishop e3. He's just going to get rolled with g4, g3. So instead, he goes d4, but d4 is sort of admitting that he's having the worst position. And now the position will be sort of crumbling. Bishop c2, d5, takes, takes, d takes e5. So now black has the advantage, has the bishop pair. What should black be aiming in this case? So it's an important situation. You get good positions, Shah gets good position, Fabiano often gets good positions. But then you have to decide what to do with it. That's the big question. What to do with your advantage. So far, you've got a solid, well, the pawn can be a nuisance on g5, but has a good pawn on e4. There is a target on e5. We can go after, but not just that, has the bishop pair. The bishop pair to work with. So in fact, he's not going to evade the trade of the queens. He's going to enforce it and says, hey, if I can open it up for these bishops on c8 and b6, my attack is just going to grow. So in an endgame, if you already have the bishop pair, that is something you can milk and use for your advantage. You have no reason to keep the queens on the board. In fact, Fabi would be the one benefiting as Mamedyarov's king is in the middle. So g4, g3. The idea what I'm saying. He's trying to open it up. Knight d4, bishop d8. And these long-range pieces can attack from anywhere from on the board. Bishop d8 is a very nice move. And now you can see white just has too many weaknesses. A pawn on e5, a pawn on h4, just way too many. Rook takes, rook g4. Bishop g5, and bishop g5 is a form of a desperado by Fabiano. He is trying to trade off the bishop pair, and in that case, he'll be down a couple of pawns, but at least he's not going to be constantly under attack. Take, take, king e7, rook d1, bishop d7, e6, takes, g6, takes. But this is already two pawns, and that's one pawn too many here. All that said, because of the relative passivity of this bishop on d7, you can consider a fine maneuver here. Can go knight c2, go knight e3, and hope for a blockade. Now Carlsen might not be on your side, but maybe luck will be, and you manage to hold this endgame. Even though black is up 2 pawns, it's not so easy to break through this blockade, that is. It's not likely be an easy task. He goes knight b3 and misplaces the knight, which is a little bit of a problem. e5, knight a5, rook b8, b4. He's trying to go for counterplay instead of passive blockade, but this knight will eventually actually find itself trapped. Rook g3, the c pawn is falling for a not so valuable e pawn. Rook takes c3 and b6. And this is what I'm talking about. You are losing your knight there, and that's why I felt that the knight on e3 would have been a little bit more stubborn. Probably still very close to losing, but more stubborn. Knight takes, bishop takes, here, rook check, king e6, check, here, king g1, and the final touch by Mamedyarov here is very beautiful. This one's a very, very beautiful move by Mamedyarov, sort of just simplifying into a clear positional advantage from a position where Fabiano could at least try to put up some fight. Notice that this rook on c7 is undefended, and Mamedyarov is going to use that to his benefit. Goes rook h1 check. You have to take. Bishop takes g2. Now, Shach was up a piece already, so this way he's just giving it back for a pawn. Rook takes c7. And now the coast is cleared. White is down only 1 pawn after rook takes g6. But look at the difference between the kings. This kings is oceans away from the right part of the board, and the a and b pawn are likely to fall. a5 continued, takes, king takes, rook e1, rook g5, and it is game over because the king is just too far away and the b pawn is just going to be coasting down the board, and there's nothing that they can do about it. So this was the lecture on Mamedyarov's winning streak and how he managed to win the first tournament of the year with the Grand Chess Tour. Thank you so much for watching, and goodbye.